So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about realism, okay? And it's not too abstract of a concept that it will take a large part of time, but we need to kind of go back a little bit to before our time frame began in the United States. And so that era of literature is known as Romanticism. And Romanticism relied on bigger than life individuals, bigger than life instances and characters that were meant to represent other things. And so probably the most famous example would be something like the Scarlet Letter or Moby Dick. Those are ones in which there aren't real characters per se, it's just that the characters represent other things, okay? And so you can say this character is the bad guy, or this is the symbol that everybody is chasing, and so on. And so you can take a look at a lot of stuff by Hawthorne and Melville, even Poe, for instance. It's hard to take any of his work seriously in the idea that these are actual real people that are walking around, living and breathing and dealing with real circumstances. So Romanticism often had a moral to the story, and sometimes it would literally like have an afterword or an epilogue that would say, okay, so this is what you were supposed to have gotten from this story. But most of the time, the Romantics were very concerned about heavy symbolism, about trying to teach people things, and so on. And so this is running during the same era as our English Romantics, and that's where a lot of this comes from. And one of the easiest ways to peg a work as romantic is take a look at the sentence structure. A lot of these sentences that you see in Romanticism, if you've read The Scarlet Letter, or if you've read Moby Dick, some of the sentences go on for like a paragraph or two. They're huge. And that's just because they're trying to cram as much detail in as possible, and so on, try to get that message or that moral across. And you can take a look too at a lot of the romantic texts just physically. They're massive beasts, okay? If you've had to pick up Moby Dick or Frankenstein as English romantic work, those sorts of things, they're usually big books, okay? Realism will be sort of a response to that, and people will start to say, well, you know, we don't need to rely on symbols. We don't need to rely on abstract concepts. We don't need to rely on characters that are somehow larger than life. We can just depict reality as it is, and that's really where the term comes from. And you'll see a lot of the writers during this time period for realism were ones who had spent some time as journalists. And so Stephen Crane, Mark Twain, those guys were in journalism. And we'll see this continue on in modernism too. A lot of the people who were modernist writers also worked early in their careers as newspaper people. They would go and write short clips and stuff like that, so they knew to keep their sentence structure straight and plain and easy to read. So with realism, basically there's no desire to teach a lesson beyond what the story has. Okay, there's no metaphysical meaning, there's no idea about man's place in the universe really or anything like that, just very ground level sorts of things. And so I always point to Stephen Crane, who writes, if you've read Red Badge of Courage, for instance, it's just a faithful documentation of the horrors of war. Okay, a kid is, I'm going to go off and shoot a bunch of Yanks and Revs and so on and so forth, and have lots of fun and come back as a man. And there's a classic scene where he comes across this dead body and it's like all covered in maggots, and he starts retching and so on. And that's really the way that realism functions. Stephen Crane will also write in Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, about a 13-year-old prostitute in New York City. And it just tells the story, okay, of this individual and their sort of day-to-day existence, their struggles, and so on. And then the moral of the story is really left to you, and how you want to proceed on this, basically. So there's nothing at the end where you're like, oh yeah, okay, that big whale represented this, okay, so therefore this. There's nothing like that. And so I always point to a nonfiction work as a prime example of this. If you've had to read or experience portions of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and Upton Sinclair will go to various meatpacking plants in the Chicago area and see a whole bunch of awful things, and he'll write essays about them. And eventually spawn what we know now as the FDA. But he would write about, that some guy would get his arm mangled in the meat crushing machine or whatever, and they would just put it in with the rest of the meat and crush it up and send it out to the butcher shops. He would talk about like big mounds of beef and just rats and mice and cats scurrying all over it, and doing whatever that they do all over it. And somebody would say, hey, I need an order for 20 pounds to go to this shop, and they would just shovel everything in, and so on. And people read The Jungle, and they were like, oh my God, this is stuff that I've been eating. There need to be some standards, and that's exactly what happens. Upton Sinclair didn't really come out and say, hey, this is an awful system, we need to do something about it. But that was sort of the end result. He didn't need to create another world, really. He didn't need to create a larger than life character or anything. That he just needed to create people, right? Or in this case, just faithfully document them. That's really realism in a nutshell, and you'll see that it's fairly straightforward to read. And sometimes when you're done with it, you're like, well, what's the point? Okay, why did I just read that? And that's really sort of what the author is saying. It's up to you, right? What are you getting out of this? And a lot of times realist writers will be concerned with issues of class. They'll be concerned with issues of gender and so on, but they're not going to come out and say it. Okay, they're not going to say, this is a story about gender, you should really pay attention to that. But instead, they'll just provide you with the story and leave it up to you to determine what the moral is.